snow layered the godswood like quiet breath, resting upon the red leaves and the pale limbs of the old weirwood, hiding the scars on the bark and the dark mouth of the carved face. John stood in that hush with his cloak tight to his shoulders and his gloves stiff with frost, watching ghost pace beneath the boughs. Every exhale turned to vapor. Every creak of branch and distant cry of raven sounded nearer for the silence. Winterfell's walls groaned as though they remembered other winters and other kings. Somewhere in the keep a forge was already awake and angry, and the clang of hammers kept time with John's thoughts. He had written the words twice already and torn them each time. The third time he wrote them, he did not tear them, though he read them again and again, as if the letters might change their meaning beneath his eye. To his high holiness, the high septon, shepherd of the faithful, keeper of the seven-pointed star. He had not loved the writing of those titles any more than he loved the thought of what he asked now. Yet the realm was splintered, and splinters would not hold back the night. A king's crown, if he could be called a king at all, amounted to a cold circlet of hammered fear when the dead marched. He needed an ally that could speak to the hearts of men and reach their hearths in a day in 100 towns. Not banners, not gold, but belief. "My lord," said Davos, his breath roughening the air. He had come softly up the path, boots leaving tidy imprints that vanished under the slow sift of falling flakes. "The maester's candles are guttering. It's time the ravens take what you've written." John nodded. "If they take it, we cannot take it back." Davos's good hand rose and fell. "I have sailed a sea I couldn't take back. We go forward or drown." Ghost stopped pacing and pressed his great head into John's hip. The old gods watched from the carved face with its bleeding eyes. John imagined another face, one hard and unmoving. No 7, each as different as a day in a week, and he wondered if they watched too. He had written of dead men walking beneath the mountains of the far north, of blue eyes shining like stars in frost, of the silence that came before their killing and the silence afterward. He had written of Craster's Keep and hard places and harder truths. He had written of obsidian and steel. He had signed his name, John of House Stark, called Snow, chosen by the North to be its king. He had written more than he liked of duty and less than he felt of fear. "We send it," he said, "before I think better of it." When he stepped from the godswood, Sansa was waiting with her hood up and her hair hidden. The snow lay on her shoulders like a mantle and made her eyes very bright. "I hear you are writing to the High Septon," she said without preamble. "I am," John said, no sense hiding what would fly on black wings before noon. "If any words can make common cause, the Sevens might." Sansa's mouth became thin at once, and 1,000 memories passed unspoken. "They will come north with stars carved into their skin and cudgels in their hands and righteousness where sense should be," she said. "They will come telling us how we must pray, and if they decide we are wanting. If they do not come," John said, "then when the dead do, we will be wanting anyway. I cannot hold the north with northern swords alone. The lords are proud and the small folk are afraid. But the Septons speak and peasants listen. A holy war can move feet faster than a levy writ. I do not care what uniform courage wears if it stands with us on the day." She studied him a long moment, and he could see the smaller motions beneath her stillness. Her fingers tightening within the muff, the slow swallow at her throat, the winter red at her nose. "Right then, but do not think you can call zealotry like a hound and be sure it will heal. If they must come, let them come to White Harbor first. Lord Manderley knows their ways better than we, and he keeps a sept of his own." "I asked them to gather there," John said. "I asked them to travel the King's Road under banners of truce and to do no harm to groves or godswoods. I asked them to bring their poor fellows and their knights, their cooks and their cobblers. I asked them to see with their own eyes what we face. You tell me I cannot call zealotry to heal. I tell you I can set it before a truth so plain that even zealotry must bow." She looked up at the sky. "And if they begin with prayers instead of bows? Then we will learn to say amen as well as we say aye," Davos muttered. "So long as their prayers end with sharpened steel." There were 100 other matters to claim John's hours. The weighing of oaths and the balancing of grudges, the distribution of grain and the allotment of cloaks and boots, the argument with House Glover over who should stand the wall at Deepwood Motte, the sending of fast riders to the last river to learn if dead men had been seen there as the wildlings swore. Yet through it all the thought of that letter floated on the surface of his mind like a leaf in a slow stream, sometimes drifting, sometimes snagging, never sinking. He told himself what he told his captains. If you want the truth to ride all roads, give it to those who already walk them. Septons and sisters, poor fellows and almsmen, even the wandering singers who still dared darken lanes. They were the realm's veins. Blood must carry warmth to cold places. At midday the ravens lifted into the gray with a disorderly beating that made John flinch. He watched their wings until the white swallowed them and then tried not to watch the sky. 7 days later, bells began to ring. The bells were not Winterfell's. They belonged to the White City where the white knife met the sea, and the sea sent its breath up the river like a herald. White Harbor's bells carried farther in winter, Davos said, as if the sound liked to run along ice. John stood on the inner battlement while the stableyards below churned to brown and the cooks shouted and the armorers cursed the cold, and he listened to bells he could not see. The snow in the yard danced in shallow spirals, eddies that spun and died, and he thought of the way crowds moved in King's Landing when word went out that a new High Septon would be chosen. He had been a boy then. He remembered the stink and the food hawkers and the way tall men leaned to see. Lord Wyman Manderley's letter came on a damp page stamped with a green trident and smelling faintly of fish. It was written in an elegant hand despite a few blots that looked like a heavy man's sleeve had dragged through them. His words were proud and careful at once. Your Grace, the faith has answered. They march on the mended King's Road. They carry bread and swords, and many of their swords do not know yet what they must cut. I have given them salt and counsel. They have set the old sept bells to ringing, and I have rung them with them. For though I am a lord of the north, my house keeps to the 7. Do not fear that I forgot your charge. There has been no insult to groves or gods. The masters of the ships are unloading the first bales of obsidian from Dragonstone into my warehouses even now. The ships fly a black banner with a red dragon. The queen who sent them sends greetings in fire and in good sense both. If you and she can hold together, Your Grace, the realm may yet see another spring. If not, well, I have baked pies for dearer guests and worse ends. Davos grunted low at that. The old whale grows a poet in winter. John read the line about Dragonstone twice and felt some tightness he had not named ease a little. Dany's men had quarried the obsidian and loaded it onto her cogs and galleys. Her people, the eunuchs and the rough men from far cities and the few Westerosi who had bent the knee, had shaped it into arrowheads and spear points until Dragonstone's caves sang with work. She had sent it north before herself, with a firm hand in the ledgers and a message as practical as it was proud. If we face a common enemy, then we share the blade. She had sent a second message with a different heat. I am coming, but not alone. Between one letter and the next, winter gnawed at the edges of the north. The last of the hill clans straggled through snow-choked passes toward Winterfell or broke to ground wherever stone and wind made a compromise. A raven from Deepwood Motte spoke of a pale fog that moved like a living thing along the shore. A rider from Widow's Watch said the sea itself had grown a crust that shattered under a man's weight, as if it were learning to freeze. A squat cask from the Night's Watch arrived by sled with a sorry, stiff boy and a message burned into his memory. They were still holding the wall, but Eastwatch saw things in the surf, and a long low moaning at night that was neither wind nor whale. And along the old King's Road, a column came northward with stars on their breastplates and stars carved raggedly into the skin of their foreheads. At their front rode a man who had been lordly once, before he turned holy and then turned harder than either. A spare, blonde shadow of a man whose scars set the way repentance sits, not hidden, not flaunted. He called himself Brother Lancel now. The shaved light of his head seemed to throw the cold back. They came singing, but the songs were not joyous. They were work songs of the soul, a chant to fill the ache of long miles and numb hands. The warrior make me brave, the smith make me strong. The mother see us kindly, the father judge us true. The maiden walk beside us, the crone show us the road. The stranger, there they faltered. In some throats that seventh name came soft, a word you did not quite hear even when your ears strained, and in others it came like a cough cut short. They carried their stars and their cudgels and their patched cloaks. Half of them had swords. A third had horses. All of them had eyes that burned like a fever that would not break. From farm to hamlet to market town they gathered more. Simple folk with faces weathered like fence posts, youths with cheeks hardly shaved, a few old men whose trembling stopped when they prayed. Poor fellows they called themselves, and some of them had nothing but the clothes on their back and a stick in their hand. Others had an edge of steel laid over wood, and a smith's brand new blister on their palms. Brothers of the warrior's sons rode amongst them like knots in a rope, watching, guiding, sometimes breaking up a quarrel with a few words of scripture and a promise of the cookpot. They had sisterhood too, women swathed in gray who kept the children near and kept the sores bandaged, who could strip a trout with a knife in 3 neat motions and sing a child to sleep while they did it. 700 souls became 1,000, 1,000 became 3. By the time the column reached the neck, where the road narrowed and the bog gave them a yellow eye, it was not a column at all. It was a river of folk moving under a single thought. At Moat Cailin, the crumbled stones watched them pass without much interest, as if they knew all invasions ended badly there. But the marsh gave up no hostility, and the reed men kept to their causeways and their quiet. A reed boy with a cattail-tufted spear stood and stared until Brother Lancel's horse nearly nudged him, and then the boy said with unexpected gravity, "The old gods watch the green men and the small. Tread softly." "We will tread as a penitent treads," Lancel answered, "and if our tread is loud, may it be heard not as trespass but as warning." The boy blinked once, as if he had not expected sense, and then he melted into cattail and fog, and the march went on. Snow began to fall again, and then it never quite stopped. White Harbor met them with banners in green and white, fish fat as a smile painted on them, and with a long pier of ice that men had hacked to something like stair and the barefoot bravest had tested with toe caps. Lord Manderley was too heavy for stairs of ice, but his men came with lanterns and barrels of salt beef and sacks of oats and even apples with their skins wrinkled tight. The Manderley Sept's doors stood open and warm, and its Septon, a prim man with careful hands, came personally to wash the feet of 10 poor fellows before the crowd grew too thick. The city buzzed like a hive. To see so many Southerners at once in the north, and not as invaders, made the small folks' mouths go crooked with amazement and suspicion both. They brought stars and songs, a fishwife muttered to her neighbor over nettle tea. "If the dead don't care for either, what then?" "They brought hands," her neighbor said, and spat into the brazier and then, embarrassed, crossed herself awkwardly in the air, the way those who keep 2 sets of gods sometimes do when one oath might cover both. "Hands is more than some bring. And look there, Lord Wyman's got them cutting obsidian like honest work. In the Lord's warehouse by the river, the dragon glass made a sound like cold when they worked it. Knappers from Old Town who had shaped arrowheads for hunting boar found their art newly holy. A man who could split a nodule along its grain with a carven bone tool and coax from it a point thin as understanding found himself surrounded by watchful faces as if he were a priest, and perhaps he was. The poor fellow's hands bled, and they held their palms to the chimney's smoke and said blessings through their teeth and kept working. The warrior's sons watched and learned the feel of a dragonglass spear in the hand. A different balance, a different bite, a promise of shattering if badly handled. Brothers in gray wrapped finished heads in oiled cloth, counted them, and sent them north under guards who bore both star and direwolf on their sleeves. A little girl with a missing front tooth found a chip of obsidian that shone like a black star, and when she held it up to the lantern light, it seemed for a moment to hold the lantern's flame inside. She felt brave without knowing why and went home by the long way, looking into every alley as if to catch death by surprise. The day the Faith's vanguard reached Winterfell, the snow had decided to fall in larger pieces, wet and heavy, and the forecourt turned to sludge where the white sank and then yielded to brown. Tormund Giantsbane came to see what Starks had invited to their hearth and stood with his fists on his hips like a farmer assessing a strange crop. "They've got bits of God carved into their faces," he said, amused and uneasy at once. "Fewer gods does not make a man less hungry. It might make him more," Davos said under his breath. Hunger and righteousness make for a hard mouth. Sansa had the household arrayed as if a king came calling. The stark banners hung, the hall fires banked just so, the bread hot from the ovens, the ale heated with cloves and the last scrape of honey. Arya skulked just outside the arch and made faces at Brienne, who did not see because she was doing the work of 2 men and half a woman keeping the crowd from pressing too tight. Jon stood beside the doors and felt, with a strange split of sensation, both host and supplicant. Brother Lancel dismounted and came forward and bowed his head, not his back. "Your Grace," he said, and the words seemed to sit uneasily in his mouth, as if once he had said them to another such man and those words had curdled in his throat later. "We are come as you asked, in peace and in arms." Jon went down 2 steps to meet him. At this distance he could see the carved star above the man's eye, the pink of it like an old stain. He offered his hand, and after a heartbeat Lancel took it. His fingers were cold and dry. "You will have our welcome," Jon said, "and our work. You asked in your letter how a man of the 7 fights a foe that never breathed. I thought it best to show you. I am not the faith," Lancel said evenly. "I am its servant, but I take your meaning." "Come inside," Sansa said, just loud enough to be official. "We will feed you and listen, and we will speak, and then we will see." They ate on benches. The high and low mixed more closely than Winterfell would have done in any other winter. Knights of the warriors' sons crouched beside butchers' sons. The sound of spoons and teeth and sighs filled the hall. Sister Muriel, a woman with a hawk nose and kind eyes, blessed the trenchers. Maester Wolkan stood aside and watched the looseness of order with visible discomfort until Arya made a face at him and he flushed and looked away. The old songs of the North were not sung that night, and neither were the faiths. Some common tunes crept in, travelers' melodies that carried forward because no one took offense at them. When the bowls were mostly empty and the ale had made men honest without making them fools, Jon rose. "There is a barrow south and west of here where men say the ground is younger than the bones," he said into the new quiet. "It is a mile from the King's Road and half a mile from a stream. A week passed. A shepherd boy from there came to us and said the sheep would not go near the stream anymore. He said the frost stayed on the grass in a ring at noon. He said his dog would not bark facing north." "He is a wise dog," Tormund called, and laughter pricked the tension and let some air in. "We sent riders," Jon said. "We sent Ser Jorah Mormont with them and a dozen good men and 2 wildling trackers. 1 tracker came back. He is here if you doubt me." He went down to the stream at dusk and saw where the reeds froze when they should not, and saw that every blade of grass lay as if a heavy thing had passed. He saw the dark shape of men walking where no men had walked that day. He saw a hand in the frost that had torn the skin and the nails and left the fingers pale as ice. "We will go to that barrow tomorrow at first light with a company of your choosing and of mine. We will not seek to fight if we do not have to. But if we must, we will, and you will see what it is you have come to face." Brother Lancel's eyes did not turn away. "At first light," he said. "I'll go," said Brienne at once, and her voice carried, "for the realm." The words had the weight of a vow that had already been lived. "I'll go," Tormund grunted, "for a good story." And the hall laughed again, but his hand settled on the haft of his axe as if it had a mind. Sansa's hand found Jon's arm under the table. "You will not go alone." "No," he squeezed her fingers once. A quick, secret contact. "No, I will not." Dawn came dull as pewter and raw as a scraped knee. The troop that rode out of Winterfell's east gate had a look of odd purpose, the sort that only grows when men who mistrust each other decide to put their backs together. Spears with new black points rode alongside old steel whose shine had been swallowed by winter. The warriors' sons wore plates that had seen better polishing, and the poor fellows wore what they could, a patchwork of armor and sense. Stark men-at-arms in iron caps marched with them, and 3 of the free folk jogged lightfoot on the roads shoulder the way wolves use a hunter's trail. They found the barrow where the boy had said, a long hump in the snow, the stones around it like a ring of teeth buried to the gums. There was the stream, too, narrowed by ice so that the water's voice sounded pinched. No sheep grazed near. reeds heavy with frost bent toward water that did not thaw even where it ran quick. The trees that bordered the meadow were quiet and held themselves very stiff. The wind had gone elsewhere. It did not come fast. Perhaps they did not like to be watched. Perhaps they were only slow sometimes, like hunger. Either way, it began with the shaking of reeds when there was no wind, and then a dark shape slid through the low water, and then the first of them showed himself in that crude, horrifying way of theirs, by being a thing that should not move and yet did. He was a man who had been a man. He had been heavy and thick through the chest in life, and the dead had not taken that away. But the skin had gone from his cheeks and left his jaw muscles like ropes. His lips drawn so that the teeth showed. The eyes were blue like the heart of ice. When he took a step, the reeds rhymed fresh. 2 others came behind him. A woman with her hair still stuck to her forehead as if sweat had dried there once, and a boy who had not been a man for more than a year. The boy's ear dangled on a strip of skin that cracked and did not bleed. They moved past the stream onto the snow with the careful inevitability of a hand placing pieces on a sivas board. One of the poor fellows crossed himself in the old way and then drew his star traced with the tip of his cudgel in the air, as if wary not to offend. His mouth moved and John heard the tale of it. "And deliver us from the stranger." Brother Lancel touched his thigh with 2 fingers and then dropped his visor down. He looked smaller with his face hidden, as if humility had become literal. "Hold the line," he said, and his men did. Tormund spat into the snow. Brienne drew. John felt Ghost press close to his knee. He felt the quiet weight of the dragon glass at his back. The whites came without sound until steel met flesh that was not. Then the sounds were messy and human again. Metal on bone, the breathless grunt, the startled curse. Fighting them had never been beautiful. The heavy man took a sword to the shoulder and did not seem to notice. The boy reached for a horse's leg with the blind persistence of a weed crack in spring. The woman bent with impossible speed and rose with a dagger she had not owned in life. It went badly for a moment while the men with steel hacked and found hacking to be a poor answer. "Glass!" John shouted, and his voice broke through fear like a hammer through ice. "Glass! The heads!" He threw the spear he had slung from his shoulder, black tip flashing, and it struck the big one below the ear. For a heartbeat nothing happened, and then everything did. The blue fled his eyes as if poured out, and he folded like a garment someone no longer needed. He fell in an ordinary way, and the ordinary thump of weight on ground marshaled their courage better than a priest's whole sermon. After that, the learning went fast. Brienne's second thrust found the woman's throat, and the woman laid down as gently as one who has been bored of life for a long time. A poor fellow whose hands had been shaking learned they could be steady for one final thing and put a black dagger into the boy's eye. The boy fell and looked young again. When 4 more came from the trees, moving quicker, they met a line that knew, and though that line wavered, it did not break. It became work. It became, if not easy, then at least known. The wind came back say-so, cold as oath-breaking. The reeds stopped shaking. Men sucked in breath like drowning ones when lifted, and looked at one another through the slits of their fear and found faces they might have hated yesterday. Ghost had blood on his muzzle and a chip of ice clinging to his whiskers. Brother Lancel lifted his visor. His eyes were raw and very bright. "This is the foe," he said, and the words made steam and vanished and left the truth behind. He turned to the sister with the hawk nose. "Right," he said. "Right to the high septon and the seps and the houses that still listen. Tell them we have held the hand of the stranger, and it was not our God but a thief of breath that wears our dead like a mask. Tell them the realm lies in the path of him. Tell them—" He faltered, and John saw something move inside the man, an old stone, perhaps, shifting. "Tell them I have sinned many ways, and I have seen no sin so hard to forgive as indifference in the face of this. Tell them to come." Sister Muriel wrote with her glove off despite the cold, as if penance were ink. She wrote with quick neatness, and her lips mouthed the words silently as if tasting their weight. The warriors' sons did not forget they were who they were when the campfires were lit that night. They formed prayer circles, they spoke to the peasants about tithes of time and of grain, they sang low. The wildlings did not forget either, and there were a few snarls over whether a strip of meat should be blessed before it was roasted or not, and one fistfight over whether a child should be named for the maiden or for a grandmother who had gouged out a man's eye with a spoon in the famine 5 years ago. Sansa kept it from running to blood by the careful magic of cooks and mothers, and when that failed, Brienne's silent height. Jon went from fire to fire until his words were gone and his presence became his last persuasion. "They'll want to carve stars into the foreheads of my men," Tormund grumbled, chewing. "I'll give them something to carve." "They will want to carve certainty into anything that stands still," Davos said. "It is what men do when the world stops making sense. And yet..." He gestured at the black shapes of spearheads stacked near the smithy's spark. "They work. They learn. They will die. What else can a man ask of an ally?" "Sense," Sansa murmured. "But perhaps that is dear in any quarter." Before the next dawn, a raven went out of Winterfell carrying Sister Muriel's words and Jon's and Lord Manderly's and a thin scrap from the maester with a list of what dragonglass they had and what they would need. By the week's end, the faith answered in 100 small ways. A sept in the Reach sent 20 poor fellows and 3 priests and a mule. A petty lord in the Crownlands wrote that he would pay for 50 spears. A baker in King's Landing sent a note by way of a wine merchant saying that she had never trusted dragons, but she had always trusted the mother, and so she would bake through the night and send what she could by cart. And then, like a bell hit hard, another answer came. This one under a seal of beeswax impressed with a 7-pointed star. "Your Grace," wrote the High Septon, "we have read the words and wept. We do not weep often. This priesthood is as corruptible as any flesh, but even flesh may rise from kneeling. I have preached to men who hear only what feeds their hatred. I will now preach to their hunger for life. Know that we shall send what swords we can spare and break the piggy banks of the houses that listen and tell the men of the city that the path to heaven may, for once, lead north. We do not command the great. We only uncover what they already desire to do when they are best. Help us help them be best. We will send one other thing we hope is not unhelpful. Penitent men who were soldiers before they were sinners. You may find use for those who know the old lines of battle and have had time since to think about them." Davos read and scratched his cheek. "Penitents are like mended nets," he said. "They hold in a calm and gape in a storm. But sometimes you catch a fish you could not with a new net." "They will come," Jon said. He felt it as a tug under the sternum. Not joy, but a weight that settled right. The realm will hear its own voice coming from another's mouth. That is how wars are won. "Wars are won," Davos said briskly, "by long lists and short tempers held in check, and by food." He lifted a second letter. "Lord Manderly says the Queen's ships will send a second load of obsidian soon. He asks who is to pay the stevedores." "Tell him the Queen," Jon said, and the word surprised him in his own mouth. He had resisted the way it wanted to be said, with capitals, as if speaking them gave away more than he wished to. "She wants the realm's goodwill. Buying it with coin is cheaper than buying it with blood." It did not remain cheap. Each week brought a skirmish or a glimpse, a hunter flayed by a white thing that moved along a treetop, a shepherd's hut with the door broken inward and the snow inside too pure, an old woman whose footprints went out and came back in wrong. Men learned. They learned again. They took obsidian to bed in leather wraps like a last comfort. They showed the faith how to burn their dead quickly and without a fuss. The faith showed the North how to boil water for safety and prayed over their cauldrons and made even stubborn men drink. In the courtyard, the smiths learned to set dragonglass heads into ash shafts with glue that did not mind cold. And a boy whose father had been a thatcher learned to bind them with a thatcher's shirty so that they did not slip even when wet. At White Harbor, ships with dragon prows came and went, and the sight of those prows in the north became less a cause for gossip and more like weather, remarked and endured. A third letter from Dragonstone bore the Queen's hand, not a scribe's, and it read with the clarity of command. "My men will bring more obsidian than you ask for. They will bring also men of the Unsullied to guard the quays and to make sure the cargo reaches your warehouses. I have no patience for thieves who steal from wars. If any lord hinders them, I will know his name." John smiled despite himself and wrote back with equal plainness. The North will hinder no one who bears what we need. Bring more than you think enough. Then he put aside the letter and stared into the candle's guttering curve. When she came, he would need to stitch another seam into this patchwork. He had invited one kind of zealotry. He would now receive another. But she had sent obsidian promptly and without haggling names and primacy. He respected promptness in a world that stumbled from one task to the next. When Daenerys Targaryen came at last, she came as winter's plainest thing. Breath on the air, engines of war. She came with the black shadow of wings cutting the low clouds just once. Long enough to set men within the walls to shouting and women to crying and old Nan's granddaughters to pointing. She came with a train of riders and spearmen and a handful of banners that she flew for courtesy more than need. She came with her hair unbound and her jaw set and her eyes tired in a way that told Jon she had not slept much for a fortnight. They met in the yard because neither wanted to seem to seek shelter first. The dragons circled once and then went to ground outside the walls in a long hiss of steam where their bellies touched snow. 100 men forgot to breathe for a count of 10. "Your Grace," Jon said when she was dismounted and in reach. He bowed as far as he could without lying outright. "The North is in your debt." "Not yet," she said, and her voice made the title sound like kindling rather than oak. "When the dead are dust, you may owe me begrudging thanks. Until then, I would accept courtesy and a room where the wind is not invited." "You are welcome," Sansa said before Jon could fumble toward hospitality. "You and your men and your beasts." "They are not beasts," the Dragon Queen said, but she said it gently, as if it were a correction she had made many times. "They are my children. They will not harm you unless you make what you do not understand into a target." Her eyes slid to the cluster of warrior sons whose hands had tightened on their hilts when the dragons passed. "And they will not burn you unless you strike them. Do not strike them. They take offense easily, like men." "They take offense," Tormund muttered, "because they are bloody dragons." And Arya smothered a laugh. If the faith had troubled at the thought of joining battle with wildlings, they had more trouble now. They had known the Targaryen restoration as a rumor or a prayer for justice or a warning, depending on the September. Many wore the history of the faith militant centuries ago wore against the Iron Throne the way their scars wore them, just under the skin. Their eyes went long when dragon shadow passed over them. Some crossed themselves. Some muttered scripture under their breath and thought it quiet. Brother Lancel went to his knee when the queen passed him, not as subject to sovereign, but the way a man kneels to prevent his temper from rising to his feet without permission. "Your Grace," he said, "the faith fights here because the stranger walks too freely in the North. It is not to stand between you and any throne." "Good," Daenerys said. "I would rather you stand between my men and any northern pride that would drag them into quarrels we cannot afford." She did not smile when she said it, and after a heartbeat, Lancel did. It was a quick thing, and it made him look younger, and for a moment Jon saw a boy who had been a Lannister and careless. In the week that followed, the yard filled with the clang of unfamiliar drills. The Unsullied taught, not by words, but by repetition and gaze. The warriors' sons learned to keep formation when their hearts urged them to break it. The poor fellows learned to thrust as one instead of a flurry of fear-born motions. Northern men watched and borrowed what suited. The wildlings ignored all of it until Tormund shook his head, muttered, and then made them try, and when they made it into a contest of pride, it went better. Brienne moved through the ranks like a ship among smaller craft, correcting without scolding, and a boy from the Rills who had never seen a dragon before found he could fight when he held the image of its black belly in his head like a steady drum. Daenerys watched from the wall sometimes, hair unbound and cloak heavy about her. The faith watched Daenerys. Once Jon found Sister Muriel standing in the gods' wood with a boy of 8 and explaining softly, "Yes, the queen rides a dragon, but that does not make her a god. Some people confuse the shine of torchlight for the dawn. It is dangerous to grip at either. We pray to the true dawn." "Does your true dawn have teeth?" The boy wanted to know. His eyes turned to where Drogon slept in a long, lazy coil that steamed. "That one does. The true dawn does not need teeth." the sister said. But sometimes it borrows them. The first large battle was not the last, but it carved a shape in the North's memory as clear as a river-carved stone. It took place in the Bar-Rolands, where the earth rose and fell in ancient humps under snow, and the only trees were hawthorns twisted to a perpetual shiver. Scouts had seen the fog and the blue between. John had stood in the hall, his palm pressed flat to the table, and said, "There," and the table had shown a flat, unhelpful plain, and men had nodded as if they saw inward what they wished to see in the world. They marched under a sky that had forgotten how to be any color but tired. The North sent 500, the Faith 4, Daenerys 300 unsullied, and a handful of Dothraki, who seemed offended by the idea of marching and danced on the edge of the columns like sparks. The dragons went ahead with a sound like a rope pulled through snow. They were a promise and an irritant both. The dead did not wait in ranks. They spilled where the land encouraged spilling, in gullies and through clumps of hawthorn, and they rose from drifted snow like mistakes uncovered. The first wave was clumsy. The second was better. The third wore bits of armor, as if some cold wit had remembered how a man resists steel and had chosen to borrow what worked. In their middle, another walked. The air near him cracked. The snow was glass. He moved with the lazy contempt of something that had never been a man, and the blue of his eyes made the brave swallow. John had known he might see one. His preparation had been a private thing, like preparing to speak a name you have never said aloud. When he saw the other, his throat worked without sound. He pulled in air that stung and said, "Too low for anyone. All right?" Then he lifted his sword, and Ghost lifted his head with him. It became a fight of lines and breaks. The Unsullied held a frontage with their shields that the poor fellows could fold themselves against. The warriors' sons struck like heavier thorns at the moments when the line wanted to fray. Northern men dashed and fell back and dashed again, their way not elegant but stubborn. Dragonglass made the difference in 100 small places. In 100 more, the difference was a shouted word at the right time or a man who refused to run when sense would have. Drogon came only once, and then not too low. Fire rolled and made glass. Whites burned without smoke. But fire needed air and breath and time, and it could not be everywhere. Daenerys held him back after that, and when a young poor fellow screamed, "Burn them all!" it was with terror, not madness, and his friend gripped his wrist and said, "No, hold." Brother Lancel saw the other in the way men feel the spot on their tongue where a tooth is gone, by the ache it made everywhere. He pointed with his sword and shouted, and a knot of the faithful and the stubborn and the trained burrowed toward that cold like men shouldering into bad weather. The other stood and watched them come with something like amusement. The whites moved quicker near him, like minnows around a bigger fish. It was not a fight that belonged in a ballad. It was clumsy and rushed and wrong. Men slipped and cursed and found their feet. A spear but tangled in a cloak. A dragonglass dagger skittered on ice, and a boy threw himself on his belly for it and came up with frost on his eyelashes. Lancel took a cut to the thigh from a white whose dead hand gripped a living blade, and he staggered and would have gone down if Sister Miriel had not put her shoulder under his and shouted in his ear, "Stand, you idiot, stand, you have not finished your vow." And he stood with a terrible grin and blood in his boot. The other moved at last when John came close enough to see the seams of the thing's face, the way no warmth had taught it to smile. His blade was ice and sang the wrong note. John's was steel and Valyrian, dark and light together. When the blades met, sound behaved like a startled animal. It bolted and then came back, unsteady. John's bones knew the shock. He pressed. The other was quick. It did not pant. It did not sweat. When it moved, the air learned obedience. Ghost leapt and met a wall of cold that made him yelp and twist and come at it again with the anger of pain, not courage. Brienne reached John's shoulder and threw her weight into the next exchange and went backward on the ice and pulled herself up without looking to see if her teeth were still in her head. Lancel, legs slick with blood, moved like a man who had given up choosing the hour of his death and found the giving up a relief. "Here," Sister Miriel shouted in a voice like a bell with a crack in it, and she hurled the spear she had kept slung over her back. Lancel caught it with a luck that looked like faith and not either and jammed his ruined leg under him and thrust. The spear struck the other not squarely but enough. scraping along its ribs with a squeal like frost climbing glass and finding purchase finally just below the left shoulder where even a thing with no heartbeat seemed to mind. The head bit with a crunch like a brittle thing broken. The other's eyes flickered. It looked down as if insulted. It moved as if to remove the thorn. John moved quicker and swung long claw and felt the strangest resistance, as if he were cutting water that did not wish to be parted. Then the thing shattered like a glass knocked from a table, and the shards were the wrong kind of cold, and the whites near it fell like men tripped by their own graves. They stood gasping in a ring where the frost had chewed the ground glassy, and the air cut them like knives from inside their lungs. Someone began to laugh, high and half-mad, until the laugh turned into a cough, and then into a sob, and then into breath again. Lancel went to one knee because his leg demanded it. Sister Muriel went to hers because she had, always, a habit of prayer after the practical act. John leaned on his sword and knew that his arms would shake when he tried to lift them again, that the shaking would make him feel small, and the feeling small would make him angry, and that both were less than the work ahead. Brienne rolled her shoulder and grimaced and lifted her helm to spit blood and put it back without comment. They burned the fallen. They said words over them. Some the old, some the new, some that belonged to no god and every grief. The poor fellows sang low as they fed each body to the careful flames. A wildling woman said the names of her brothers as if saying them would make the smoke find them. A knight of the warrior's sons, his star carved neat and healed, put his hand on a northern boy's head and did not know what to say and stood that way anyway, which was perhaps better. That night in the hall, the dragons slept outside and the wind worried at their wings like a small, bold animal. Men ate what they could and then fell asleep in their clothes like spent arrows. John could not sleep. He went again to the God's Wood, and Ghost went with him. The face in the weirwood looked down and would not tell him if inviting the faith had been folly or wisdom or the only path a wise folly could tread. He had come to understand that the trees spoke most freely when you were not listening for their voice. Daenerys found him there. She did not speak first. He did not turn. They stood a while with the snow whispering in the branches. "I do not like them," she said at last softly. He had learned she did not waste effort on things that did not matter. These men with stars cut in their faces and their mouths full of simple answers. "I have broken one set of men who used a god to make a chain and enthroned another who called themselves freed with that god's name folded into their pride. But today," she stopped. When she spoke again, the words were as careful as stepping stones across a frozen stream. "Today I saw zealotry hold a line so that my unsullied could live. Today the poor fellows kept formation the way I have asked a dozen local levies and seen them fail. I saw one of your wild men jab a piece of black glass into death's eye and laugh like a story. I saw you break a thing that will haunt me. I have been a queen long enough to know that liking has little to do with what must be done. Still, I would prefer allies I did not fear would turn and decide I am the enemy the first day the dead do not stand in front of me." "They won't," John said, and knew he was lying to her or to himself. He was not sure which. "Not while they can look over their shoulders and still see the fog. Not while they smell the dead. And after is a thing we can only purchase by doing this part well." He turned and found her eyes in the dark, the way the gods would made even fire-born things blue. "I invited them here because we need their numbers and their words. They will go south, every one of them, and tell 100 folk what they saw. Not all will believe. Enough might. You play a long game for a man who fights like a hammer," she said, and he did not know if that was reproof or admiration or both. "Very well. I will not burn their septents, however they look at my dragons. I will give them steel and teach them to use it, and I will listen to their prayers and count the ones that can be turned into orders. They will say you are a sin in skin," John said gently. "They will say your birth is a wrong in the world's fabric. Some days they will say it quietly. I am familiar with the murmurs of men who fear what does not kneel," she said, and her smile was a brief, tired knife. "I am also familiar with the smell of the dead. I prefer the living's insults. The war 8 days. The war 8 nights. It ate the little jokes that men told to hold fear at arm's length and then swallowed the arms. It ate the sweetness of bread and left only its fuel. It ate, and men learned how to cook something out of it anyway. The faith's sermons changed in substance, if not in form. Priests spoke less of sin and more of light that could be tended, of hearths that must not be allowed to die, of how the seven were faces of the same compassion, and that compassion had a sword in its hand when compassion alone could not stand. They did not speak much of the stranger. They began to speak of the others by name, as if naming fear deflated some of it. In the Septent, candles were allowed to gutter lower than before because tallow was wanted for other purposes. The poor gave as the poor always do, from near empty to emptier and smiling a cracked smile at the pride of it. Old gods and new shared the same air, and sometimes the same man. There was a day when a northern lord who had scowled through 100 of the faith's gestures of grace took his dead daughter to their tent because it was nearer than the gods would, and Sister Muriel washed the child and kissed her forehead and put her into the flame with words the father did not understand, and the Lord wept and did not mind the words. There was a day when a southerner put his hand to the weirwood's trunk and went still and came away with snow in his hair and said nothing, ever, about what it had felt like. Arya began to teach little boys from the Crownlands how to hold a blade so they would not cut themselves. She called them little crows and they laughed and became less useless. Brother Lancel grew slower with a wound that would not wholly heal and grew more dangerous. He learned to husband his strength like candle ends and spend it in sudden bright throes of will, and then to sit with his leg extended and listen to Sister Muriel scold as she stitched. He listened to northern men tell stories that made no sense, of a giant with bells in his beard who had died for them, of a girl who had changed her face, of a king who had given up a crown. He told fewer stories of his own life than a man might with his scarred past, but once he said very soft, "I was a fool for a long time and then I tried being a saint. Both are merely masks. This is better. This hurting and then not, this working until I fall asleep in my boots. If the gods had wanted me to be a saint, they would have given me easier work." When spring tried twice and failed and winter smiled and put its teeth back in, the last of the long battles came down from the east along the White Knife as far as the Manderleys dared keep their ships in. The river froze and thawed and froze again and cracked like a whip. The dead flowed with it, learning the river as if they could be water. They came in sleets of bone white and mud black and the color of salt. They came between willows that had never known such weight, and they pushed that weight onto the ice and it held. White Harbor rang its bells not in greeting now but in warning, and Lord Manderley rose from a bench with a groan and put his hands to his belly and called for a chair he could be carried in. And John went down the steps 3 at a time, and Daenerys summoned her child with a whistle like a scream swallowed, and the faith ran with their stars bright as knives. It was no longer practice. The dead had learned. They used logs to test ice. They put weight where men did not expect and pushed where men thought the world would not give. They came under the river's lip with straws in their mouths like boys in a summer pond who think they are safe because they can breathe. But men had learned too. They set fires under the foot of bridges so the ice would not form there and then doused them to keep them from becoming the very thing they feared. They stationed archers in warehouses that had windows for winches. They lined the quays with barrels of sand and pitch and dragonglass and salt. They had the Unsullied, whose shields formed neat arcs. They had Dothraki, who rode along the quays like a mad song. They had the 5 of the faith's best singers calling out time for rows of thrusts. They had the North's stubborn children laughing when they should have been crying and not dropping the billets they passed from hand to hand. In the middle of it, Ghost went missing and John went mad for a quarter of an hour until he saw the white streak of him on a warehouse roof and realized the wolf had found a way to do what he could not: see from above what the dead were trying. He followed Ghost's line of stare and saw the place where they were piling weight in a clever, patient way. He shouted, and Brienne and a dozen listened, and Dragonfire sheared off just enough of the weight to send it crashing. The river bucked. Whites flailed and went under and bobbed up and went under again, and some drowned, if drowning is the word for a thing that does not breathe and still cannot rise against a river's will. On the 3rd day, Brother Lancel died. It was not grand. He did not hold a sword aloft while 1,000 men watched. He did not give a speech. He had fallen on the first, leg cut opening again and Sister Muriel furious as she bound it, and risen on the second and given his sword to a boy with a better ankle and taken a spear instead. On the third he stood in the wrong place at the wrong time with a star bright as spit on his brow, and put his spear into a white that had been a woman, and then a second that had been a man, and then a third that had been nothing anyone there could have ever known. His spear broke on the fourth. The fourth went through him. He had time to look offended, as if the world had reneged on an agreement, and then he sat very carefully, as if he did not wish to disturb something, and then he lay down. Sister Muriel reached him, hands red to the wrists, and said, "No," as if no could undo anything. He smiled up at her as if she had told him a joke he could not quite hear, and said, very softly, "The stranger's face looks like snow," and he was dead. After men said many things that made sense. John put his hand on the man's shoulder and did not say any of them. They burned him with the others. A northern woman whose husband had owed Lancel his life, and who would not have admitted it if you held a blade to her throat, made a little cake of oats and honey and put it on the pyre and muttered, "He fought like a Stark," and Sister Muriel, hearing, nodded without pride. When it was finally done, when the river ran free and dirty again, and the whites that had not found a second death staggered into alleys and were pinned and ended, when the dragons slept without twitching and the faith's voices were hoarse and the unsullied had re-wrapped their feet because they had lost feeling and then found it, White Harbor rang its bells again, not in triumph but in proof of life. The sound traveled up the White Knife and along the King's Road and into lesser roads and into ears that were ready to hear anything that was not fear. The High Septon's final letter came when the snow had learned to soften at the edges in the hour before dusk, and Winterfell's yard had begun to smell faintly, faintly, of damp earth beneath the smoke. It was short, as tired men's wisdom often is. "Your Grace, we are not good. We are merely alive. Being alive is a task. We will continue to send you men who can carry the weight of the task. When the foe is fled, should the foe be fled, know that men will remember how to hate. We will work then, as we have now, to turn hatred into labor. Do not let me forget my own words. I am, like any man, inclined to forget what I speak when it pains me later." John folded it and put it in his breast. He walked to the godswood and sat with his back to the weirwood and let Ghost rest his head on his knee. The face watched. The air was full of fine ice that did not fall, as if the world were asking a question and was not sure if it should. Sansa found him and sat without speaking. In the yard beyond the wall, a tense candles burned low, and in the kitchen, somebody had begun to chop onions for something and made the whole place smell like honest weeping. He had invited zealotry to his gate and then watched it turn its rage outward at a foe that deserved it. He had made himself a hinge on which the realm might turn from one door to another. Hinges where he felt worn. The worn feeling did not displease him. He had never trusted shining. Daenerys came later, her cloak rimed at the hem, her hair smelling faintly of smoke. She did not sit. She looked at the gnarled red mouth of the old god and said, "My people are building a kiln for the obsidian. Your people say the stone breaks more kindly if it is warmed before the shaping. They call the fire the smith's breath. My men do not know your stories, and yet they will use your names if it makes the work go smoother." "It often does," Sansa said dryly. "Even a false name can keep a true peace." John lifted his head and found the Queen's eyes. "When this is done," he said, "when the dead are a story again, the faith will go south and make trouble for you if you put on a crown without a prayer. The North will look at your dragons and remember old burns. If there is to be peace, it will be made in small kitchens and in workshops and in the yards where men stand and argue over whether this hammer or that glue bites better. It will be made under banners sometimes and often without them. We must stand in the way of the worst of it. We must move aside for the rest. If you ask me to make a prayer to their seven, I will not," she said without heat. "But I will stand beside a smith and say his name with respect if he teaches my men how to make these points faster. I will stand beside a woman with a star on her brow while she bandages a boy. I will stand aside when two grandmothers fight over how to bless a loaf, because the loaf will be eaten. That is all the prayer I ask," John said, and he did not know if he spoke to her or the weirwood or the gods he did not serve. "That we choose bread and blades over crowns and songs. For now, bread, blades, and bells," Sansa murmured, and smiled for the first time in days, a tired, real thing. In the months that followed, the war thinned. It did not end. It never quite ends. But it thinned. The others retreated into Story's edges where they had begun. The whites came less often, and when they came, they were met by men who knew the work. The dragons ranged farther and were less needed. The faith stars faded to pale scars on skin that weathered to brown. The Septense candles burned to nubs and were replaced by more practical lamps that smoked less. In the forge, the men learned how to warm obsidian in iron pans set over coals banked just so. And they spoke of the smith's breath because it made their hands sure. In the Septent, a sister told a story about the crone showing travelers which berries would not kill them, and a wildling corrected her gently because he had learned a different kind of wisdom in a different cold. When word came that Eastwatch still stood and the wall had not fallen and the night, if it could be called a night, had shortened by an hour and then two, the news moved through the realm not just on ravens but on tongues. It had a shape. It had bells. In King's Landing, the High Septon preached a sermon with dirty cuffs, and he spoke of a man with winter in his name who had invited holiness to his house and then told it where to sit and when to speak. He did not name John because names turn men into banners, and he had had his fill of banners. He spoke instead of a choice, and he told men there was a place for their strength that was not the stamping of another man's neck. In Old Town, a maester wrote a long, careful treatise on obsidian, how it breaks, why it breaks, what heat does to stone, and he footnoted it with lines from a Septon's catechism about the smith because he found that his students remembered more cleanly that way. In White Harbor, Lord Manderley had a chair built wider than the one he had and sat in it and took petitions and smiled and doled out coin and sermons in equal measure, and he had a baker stand beside him and teach a boy from the Crownlands how to make a northern loaf so it did not crumble. At Winterfell, the gods would knew more footprints than it had in 100 years. Some came to ask for victories, but more came to ask for enough wool and a healthy child and for the old man in the next bed to stop coughing. John came to ask for nothing he could name and to listen to the sound snow makes when it rests in place. He had always been a man who moved, but now he became a man who could sit a short while. He learned something from the faith that they had not meant to teach: how to use words to call men to labor. He learned something from Daenerys that she had not meant to teach either: how to bear a crown without letting it eat his head. He learned that ghosts snored when he was content, a little, and that Sansa's laugh when it returned sounded like the world cracking and not breaking. There were fights, of course. There were men who took the faith's welcome too far and tried to set a sept where the gods could see it and were told no. There were sisters who told a wildling girl that her name ought to be changed because the Seven did not recognize names given on wrong altars, and Arya stepped between and told them the Seven could learn to read, and the sisters looked at one another and realized that the girl would learn to stab them if they pressed it. There was a boy who had carved a star in his forehead because he wished to be brave and found he had done a foolish thing and sat crying in Sister Muriel's tent while she held his face in steady hands and told him that bravery was quieter than cutting your own skin. There was a priest who refused to bless a dragon and then refused to stop watching it sleep. He died in his blankets later of a cold that had cracked his ribs, and the men at his grave told two different stories and both were kind. In time, the dragons flew south with their mother, because dragons are not patient creatures and winter is not their best element. In time, many of the faith went south as well, because their bells are not natively northern and their words find longer echoes where a sept already stands. They left a handful of brothers and sisters at White Harbor and another handful at Winterfell, because hearths multiply when fed, and some of them had become, unawares, more northerner than not. The poor fellows left their old sticks behind and took up tools more often and found that the rhythm of hammer and saw is better than the rhythm of cudgel and chant if a man wishes to live long. The warriors' sons rode away with their stars pale on their brows and their eyes less quick to find sin. The High Septon sent no more letters, not because he had stopped thinking but because he had said what he knew and now he worked. Jon and Sansa stood on the battlements one evening when the world was blue and the yard smelled faintly of turned earth. Somewhere a bell rang, just one, the Septence, calling the faithful to share bread. Somewhere else a hammer rang, 3 beats and a pause, the old pattern of winter work. "You invited them," Sansa said, "and we did not burn for it." "We burned," Jon said mildly, "but in the right places." "That is all the art a sovereign ever learns," she said. And he did not say that he was not sure he was a sovereign or that the words still sat awkward in his belly like too heavy stew. It would not have done any good. The weirwood watched and did not offer applause. "Will you ever kneel?" she asked, not looking at him, and he knew she meant to the Dragon Queen. "If I must," he said. "If it buys time. If it buys breath. If it buys bread." He nodded. "I would kneel for bread." "So would they," he said, gesturing to the yard where a poor fellow in a patched cloak lifted a loaf with both hands and a northern woman cut it with a knife that had killed a white and then cut kindling and then cut bread. The blade did all three tasks without complaint. The world was not so different. Ghost lifted his head at nothing and then lowered it again. Snow fell, a few fat flakes that melted as they touched stone. In the god's wood, a drop of water slid down the face of the old god and caught on the lip of the carved mouth, and then it fell. It left a clean line. The line was not a sign. It was water undoing what cold had done, briefly, before doing it again. John watched it and could not help the thought. All great wars end this way, not with trumpets but with the world returning to its small labors and small mercies. He had invited holiness and found it to be merely another word for work. That was not a disappointment. It was a promise. In the years that followed, years that men would later try to pin to names and banners and find that the pins would not hold, men said, in inns and at forges and in the cool of dusk under fattening trees, that the North had learned to speak a little like a Septon and the South had learned to hold a line a little like a Stark. They said it approvingly when it meant less blood and derisively when it meant more argument. The truth sat somewhere in the middle with a cup of beer and two calices and declined to choose. And if a boy in the bar Rollins, years later, ran his fingers over a pale scar on his forehead and felt for an old star there, and could not find it and smiled because of that. If a girl in White Harbor who had once watched a dragon breathe steam learned to bake bread that held together in a ship's roll and sent a loaf north to Winterfell each new year because it pleased her. If an old sister who had bound 100 wounds and scolded twice as many fools stood very still one morning and listened to the wind in the leaves and thought, briefly, that she heard a voice that was not any god she knew and smiled about it and did not tell anyone. If all those small things happened, they were not recorded. What was recorded was that when winter had tried to make a habit of itself, men and women would not let it. They made another habit instead. They rose, they cut, they burned and buried. They learned to say words that kept other men's feet moving. They learned to hold their own tongues when a quarrel would spend more warmth than it earned. They learned that zeal is a good mule if harnessed and a bad horse if ridden. They learned that a star cut into the skin is less useful than a star stitched into the lining of a cloak. Felt, not seen, warming work. They learned that the gods and the old trees and the dragons do not, in fact, care whether a prayer is said before bread is shared, so long as the bread is shared. The bells went on ringing now and again, not to call a city to its knees or a queen to account, but to bring men to the table when the pot was ready. In that there was more victory than any song could hold. And if dawn, the true dawn, did not come as quick or as bright as men had prayed for, it still came, and it found in the north and the south both a people who had taught themselves how to live inside it again. John walked the yard one morning with Ghost at his heels and watched two men shoulder a beam together, the one with a star-faded scar and the other with a direwolf stitched into his cloak. And he thought, yes, this is what I invited. He passed the sept tent. His bell did not ring just then. The goddess of mercy, if she existed, had a smear of soot on her cheek from where a sister's hand had brushed it, and the gods would beyond breathed its slow red breath. The castle smelled of onions and leather and old smoke. He put his hand to the stone and felt the way it held the day's first heat. His hand came away smudged. He grinned like a boy and wiped it on his cloak. The world was not redeemed. It was merely stubborn. It would be enough.